Welcome back. We're about to begin our midday session for day 2 of the conference. Today, this session, I will be moderating. I just want to acknowledge and thank again so many people for being flexible and dynamic in the making of this conference. As you remember, we had to reschedule because of a labor disruption at the museum, because of a strike. So Liza Nathan from Tate Britain is actually on a courier trip right now in China where her Wi-Fi is not great. So we will be playing a pre-recording of her talk that she did before she went. So thanks, Liza, for being so flexible. So this sequence, this session will be in the following order, as you see on the screen. We have a dual presentation by Tess Graafland and Josephina de Fouw at the Rijksmuseum, talking about the history of framing and reframing at the Rijksmuseum. Elise Lopez at the Musée d'Orsay, talking about 19th century frames there and her experience. And then, as I said, the pre-recorded talk by Liza Nathan on history of reframing a single work in Tate Britain's collection. I'm going to invite next Tess Graafland and Josephina de Fouw from the Rijksmuseum, who will co-present. Of course, we have Hubert Bayek speaking later today. So we'll hear from 3 different people, all of whom who have worked in framing at the Rijksmuseum. So thank you both so much, and please take it away.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you and Julia for making this great conference happen. My name is Tess, and I am the frames conservator at the Rijksmuseum. And together, oh, it's not there yet. Yeah. With Josephina, curator for 18th century paintings and frames, we will talk about framing and reframing at the Rijksmuseum. The Rijksmuseum has a history of framing that spans over more than 2 centuries, but until the 1980s, documentation on framing is limited. In 1979, Van Tiel, one of the museum's curators, wrote a Dutch article titled "Framing Paintings in the Rijksmuseum since 1800s." And this is a source of great value from whose content I will also draw for the following slides. The first information we have on framing is from the period 1809 until 1817, when the national collections were housed in the then City Hall of Amsterdam. The cover of the book on this slide gives a rare visual image of the frames in the building. From this time, we know that the sitting director changed frames from time to time when they were found in a bad condition or not fitting in with the other frames. And in practice, this meant that many of the larger paintings were framed in black frames that had a gilded inner edge, and smaller paintings were placed in comparable gilded frames with an oil gilding that was easy to clean and considered durable. The consensus was unity, and this increased interest in framing had to do with the move of the collection from the City Hall to the Trippenhuis, where it would be from 1870 to 1885. However, in the first half of the 19th century, there were little government fund for frames and art in general due to poverty in society. And jumping forward in time towards the end of the 1870s, framings were again revised in preparation for the move to the current Rijksmuseum building that was then being built and that would open in 1885. Frames were replaced when they were damaged and worn, but also when they were stylistically not in harmony with the paintings they housed. And this was actually the first attempt to frame paintings according to their time periods and to maintain original framings. Period frames, and thank you, Julia, for elaborating so clearly on the definition of this term, were kept and restored, and all the, at that time, modern or ill-fitting frames were replaced or altered. And the profile frames could not be too deep and should be matte black, imitating ebony wood with a gilded inner edge. The museum director from 1883 to 1896, O'Brien, took it further and made more money available for reframing, as many 16th and 17th century paintings still had gilded frames from the first half of the 19th century. He was different from former directors because he felt the need for more knowledge about period frames. Throughout time, the museum made use of different frame makers to make, alter, restore, or re-gild frames. But in 1895, there was a protest from a group of frame makers, as one particular frame maker, Van Menck, who will also return later in this presentation, seemed to have a monopoly position in the market. And because of this protest, the following director, Van Riemsdijk, decided that the renewal of frames would only happen in-house and that only on rare occasions new frames were ordered. He cut down the budget as well, as he didn't share the idea of having all old paintings having black profile frames. He put paintings back in their previous 19th century gilded frames, if those still existed, and the black frames that were taken off were sometimes used for new acquisitions or for paintings that in his eyes had ill-fitting frames. The return of gilded frames went hand in hand with the rearrangement of collections that were donated to the museum. These were brought together on display in comparable frames. Schmid-Degener, director from 1922 until 1941, led a large-scale and lengthy renovation of the museum building and made drastic changes in the galleries. When it came to framing, it was aesthetics before history. There were no new frames made, but historical frames were acquired for 17th century paintings. They were ebony and oak profile frames, but also many carved and gilded Louis XIII and XIV frames from France. Frames from storage were also used, and frames were altered if needed. For the 15th and 16th century, many Spanish frames with a flat decorated frieze were acquired, and gilded frames were also toned to match the painting or the gallery they were placed in. The ideas of Schmid-Degener remained fashion for the decades to follow, but in the 1960s, under director Van Schendel, around 200 paintings from the at that time separate history department were framed with so-called Elvers frames. They were designed by the architect Dick Elvers, who was involved in the exhibition and interior design of the museum. The goal was to unify the collection, and the frames that were removed, among them also original ones, were stored. At the same time, there was a growing dissatisfaction about the policy of putting aesthetics before history, leading up to the pioneering and groundbreaking research on original Dutch 17th century frames and their development. And this resulted in the exhibition Acclaim the Frame, an accompanying catalogue, Framing in the Golden Age, in 1984 by Van Tiel and de Bruinkops. The importance of historical context was stressed when making choices for new frames, and the book became, and still is, leading for framing the 17th century. In the decades to follow, this policy slowly trickled from the 17th century onto all centuries, and with the appointment of Hubert Baya as frame conservator in 1990, the frame collection was elevated to a full-fledged collection, assigning each frame its unique inventory number. Before that, only 300 of the thousands of frames in galleries and storage were accessioned. It was also decided to stop altering period frames to fit paintings. In those cases, new frames were made after an historical example. And also when it comes to paintings that require a climate vitrine, because they go on loan to an insufficient climate, we make minimal or no adjustments to original and period frames. Instead, we have what we call travel frames made that are then turned into a climate vitrine for the duration of the loan. All the Elvers frames were removed from the galleries, but unfortunately only 80 of the 200 paintings were able to be put back in their former frames due to lack of documentation. I myself joined Huub in the frames department in 2016, and I was trained by him until his retirement in 2019. Also in 2019, Josephina was appointed as curator for frames, which enabled us to further develop framing policies. And there is now a strong collaboration between conservator and curator that also comes with more means to invest the search for historical frames. When a new framing is desired, the first step is to look into our own collection of empty frames. In collaboration with the Research Services Department, a so-called frames tool was developed to facilitate this. The font of this tool you can see on this slide. And by entering minimum and maximum side edge measurements, frames can be selected. And the tool works two ways. A painting can be looking for a frame and a frame can be looking for a painting. A perfect match is rare, but ever since the tool is in use, we have been successful several times. When there is no match in our own collection, we are looking for frames at catalogs from auction houses and dealers. We actually also go through the catalogs to look for interesting frames without the request from a painting. If there is a find, we look if there is a painting that would benefit from a new frame, and that is a right match. And if no historical frame is found, a new frame is made based on historical examples. And in the following slides, I would like to show a few examples of new framings we have done in the past years. This painting by Tjeerd Eersman, dating 1826, was acquired in 2021. It had a very modern gilded profile frame that was not appropriate for the time period. And using the frame tool, a match came forward in our empty frame collection, this Biedermeier frame with composition ornaments. After conservation treatment and changing the orientation, the frame now forms the time-appropriate ensemble with the card players. This portrait by Charles Howard Hodges came in the collection without a frame. At a small auction house in Paris, we found an empire frame that is similar to some of the original empire frames on other paintings by Hodges that are in the Rijksmuseum collection. It also happened to be a perfect fit. The frame was acquired, and after small treatment, the painting can now be seen in the galleries. As mentioned before, we are also actively looking for interesting frames. And at an auction in Germany, our eyes caught this beautiful carved and gilded 16th century Italian cassetta frame. It so happened that a 16th century portrait of a woman was found to be a fitting match. The portrait is painted in Fontainebleau, and as there was significant influence of Italian art and culture in Fontainebleau, we found the match stylistically suitable as well. And compared to his previous altered oakwood frame from a later date, in our opinion, the cassette frame is also elevating the portrait to a much higher aesthetical level. And at last, these portraits by Rembrandt arrived for a long-term loan in 2023 and were housed in these 19th century gilded neoclassical composition frames. The frames are stylistically not a match, and we also found them rather massive for the small portraits. Based on this original ebony frame from our collection on similar size portraits dating from the same period, 2 new ebony frames were made. And the frames now place the portraits in the time frame of the 17th century, and we also find them beautifully enhancing the paintings in a subtle way, instead of overwhelming the paintings. And I will now give the floor to Josephina, who will tell an exciting story of a very recent reunion of a painting and its original frame.
Thank you, Tess. Amongst the historical frames that Tess and I have been working on, there's one that stands out. The frames that Tess just showed met the paintings first in the Rijksmuseum. And the one that we're now going to focus on is a rare stroke of luck, of a reunion of a painting and its original frame. It all started a year ago with an email from an auction house in Leiden, a city half an hour traveling from Amsterdam. The auction house was going to auction a frame which they thought might originally have belonged to a painting in the Rijksmuseum collection. This is the image that was attached to the inquiry mail. It is a frame in late Louis XIV style. It has a wide ogee-shaped profile with hatching, scrolly acanthus, foliage and flowers. The corners and centers are accentuated with slightly raised acanthuses. The auction house received the frame from a private person, and it didn't come alone. In it was a still life by the Dutch painter Jurjan Marinus van Beek. What gave the auctioneer the idea that this frame belongs to another painting? It was the back of the frame, of course, that gave the first clues. There's an inscription on the back, written in pencil, traced in red here on the image below to make it better visible for you. On the left is M. Bauer, which is a Dutch painter known for his Oriental scenes. And Benares on the right most likely referred to the name of the painting that was in the frame. And the Rijksmuseum has a painting titled Benares by Marius Bauer in its collection. Before we go on with the frame, let us first have a look at the painting. Benares is one of Bauer's finest Indian paintings. It depicts Benares, one of the world's oldest cities located at the Ganges River. We see the steps that lead to the river with a bathing woman and a child on the right and rowers pushing off a sloop on the left. It is an idealized view, of course, much to the taste of Bauer's public. There's no room for suffering and poverty in this work, and instead he focuses on the beauty of the sunlit city. Bauer had been in India, and based on his drawings, he made this painting in 1913. In August of that same year, it was put up for sale by the firm A.J. van Wisseling & Co., and in less than 3 months' time, it was sold to Professor Jacob Hultgans. It remained in the family until in 2002, it was bequeathed to the Rijksmuseum. When Benares entered the Rijksmuseum, the painting no longer had its original frame. This is the frame in which it was acquired, a narrow gilded scotia frame with a line and light inlay. It doesn't really enhance the painting. Instead of leading the eye into the stairway, it makes it appear quite flat. Back to the auction house. Could this be the original frame of Benares? Tess and I went to Leiden to research the frame. First, we checked the measurements. The construction was still intact, and Benares would fit the frame exactly. The construction itself is characteristic of the period. The detail right shows the strengthening of the corner with a wooden triangular block, as was quite common in the late 19th and early 20th century. The ornaments are not carved, as was common in the previous centuries, but made of campo. That would also be what one would expect from an early 20th century frame. Besides the inscription with the name of the artist and the title Benares, there are labels at the back of the frame. 2 of these refer to exhibitions: the Biennale in Venice in 1920 and an exhibition in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1923. We looked up the catalogues and both shows featured Benares. A third label is from the frame maker. Tess already mentioned him, M. van Menck. And we found out that Van Menck was one of the regular suppliers of Van Wisseling, the dealer of the artist Bauer, the one that sold Benares to Hultgans in 1913. The archives of Van Wisseling are preserved and are a wonderful source for research. Here you see a page from a cash book of Van Wisseling showing payments made to the framemaker Van Menck for just a couple of months. In 1913 alone, the year in which Benares was sold, Van Menck supplied Van Wisseling with several hundred frames, including frames like this one in late Louis XIV style. In the account book, the sale of the painting itself to Hultgans is also documented. Under number 3203 in the red box, we can find the name of the artist, the title of the painting, the sales price, and the amount paid to Bauer, the name of the seller, Hultgans, and the date of the sale. Although Benares' picture frame is not specified in the firm accounts books, the painting would have been sold framed. An indication of this is the fact that shortly before the art dealer sold the painting, he lent it to an exhibition and he would not have submitted it unframed. Another indication that the painting was sold framed is that we found letters from Bauer to the art dealer in which he repeatedly mentions frames that were made or had to be made for his works. One example is this postcard from 1911, in which he inquires if Van Menck had already framed his drawing and if he could come and have a look at the frame. This is the same Van Menck that also produced the frame that we're studying today. To get more insight into how Bauer's paintings were framed, we looked into photographs of exhibitions. In 1912, Van Wisseling organized an exhibition in which several works by Bauer were presented. From the pictures, we learn how Bauer's paintings were framed. As well as being uniform to a standard degree, they were also customized. All three pictures on this photo are by Bauer, and especially the frame on the left resembles the frame brought to our attention by the auctioneer. Here, the works on the left and the right are by Bauer, and these appear quite modern and simplistic. So far, all evidence confirmed the hypothesis that the frame to be auctioned was indeed Besnard's original first frame. The measurements, materials, and construction, the inscriptions and labels at the back, the sale of 1913, the triangle of art dealer, frame maker, and artist, and the correspondence with other frames around paintings by Bauer. We decided to go for it. There was one other bidder, but in the end, we could acquire the frame for a very attractive price. At the auction, we continued the research. From 1913 to 2012, the year Besnard was bequeathed to the Rijksmuseum, the painting had been in the same family. So we reached out to the family to see if they could help us. They only recalled the narrow gilded frame in which the painting entered the museum, but they were very interested and started looking in their photo albums, and they found this picture. It's a photograph of the interior of Villa Het Lokhuis in Baarn. This is the house where the first owners of the painting, Jacob Hultgans and Wouterra Hultgans Steeman, lived. It's highly modern and filled with Amsterdam school furniture and contemporary paintings. And on the left, behind the sofa, Besnard can be seen in its original frame. Although out of focus, when we zoom in, we can recognize the frame that the Rijksmuseum acquired, and this was the last piece of the puzzle that we were looking for. And they found another family picture of a celebration of St. Nicholas in 1963. By then, Besnard was by the next generation, and here we see it in the frame in which it entered the museum. This means that the painting was reframed before 1963, and probably because the new generation thought the Louis XIV frame too dominant or out of character with the interior of their house. The frame arrived in the painting studio last summer. Overall, it was in good condition. There were some very small losses. One of the corners had been overpainted with bronze paint, and locally there were spider droppings. But precisely because the frame had been preserved so good, these small imperfections drew the attention, and therefore Tess treated the frame. And then the moment of the truth arrived. Besnard was put in its new/historical frame. And the effect of the white gilded Louis XIV frame around Besnard is, we think, astonishing. The scene has gained more depth. The frame leads the eye from the steps into the Ganges River below and the building above. It becomes much more vivid. It is as if the people and the city life along the river come to life. Some colors that we hardly noticed before now stand out, especially the turquoise and red details. The gold of the umbrellas on the left and the right of the painting resemble the gilding of the frame, and Bauer must have anticipated on this effect. Besnard has truly undergone a metamorphosis, but for anyone unaware of that, it is as if it has never been otherwise. And this applies not only to the painting, but also to the museum gallery in which it is exhibited. The old frame was distracting and detonated against the other frames in the gallery, many of which are still original frames, and now the painting comes much more in its place. I come to the end of our talk. These 2 days were very pairings so far, and it's wonderful to be together with so many professionals working with frames. And some of your stories have also reflected on the broad interest in frames. Yesterday, Jerry showed the spectacular Mary Ashfield frame presented in the exhibition Making Her Mark, and Julia told how, in response to recurring questions from visitors, the Art Gallery of Ontario has now included frames in some of the paintings labels in the permanent collection. Tess and I, together with our colleagues from our digital team, made a short video about Benares that was posted on social media last Friday. I just checked, and on Instagram alone, it has over 27,000 likes and over 550 comments. That's more than twice as much as average. In the comments, there are many questions left by people who want to know more. And that shows that there's a great interest and a big potential, which is so inspiring and motivating. Likewise, we're happy to share this story with you in more depth. Not because it's kind of a feel-good story, but because this case study makes clear how questions about the authenticity of an ensemble can benefit from a multidisciplinary approach. And this is the kind of research that Tess and I hope to do more often in future. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Josephina and Tess. That was an absolutely riveting discussion. If you wouldn't mind, if you can share the links in the chat that you had posted on your last slide. I'm sure many people would love to see that video, myself included. And yeah, I mean, I should just say, I always joke that it's finding the match or the original frames like finding a needle in a haystack, but it's so thrilling when you can make that kind of reconstruction. So congratulations. Our next talk is by Elise Lopez from Musée d'Orsay, and she'll be telling us about the 19th century frames in Paris at the Orsay. So welcome, Elise.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. First, I would like to thank you all to be here. And I have to say that all the presentations so far were so enlightening. Of course, many thanks to the Art Gallery of Ontario for giving me the opportunity to share with you this presentation. So today I'm going to talk about the Musée d'Orsay's collection of empty frames and how it gave me the will, the inspiration to start a PhD research about 19th century Parisian frame makers. So for those who have never had the chance to visit the museum, here is some very basic information. The Musée d'Orsay specializes in 19th century European arts, and it's very well known for its collection of Impressionist painters, as Monet, Manet, Degas, Cézanne, and so on. Painters from whom the collection of what we call artist frames has already been partly studied by a former painting curator of the Musée d'Orsay, Isabelle Kahn, and for sure some of you in the audience too. And if I am not mistaken, there is a presentation that follows about a reframing of a Seurat painting, and I'm very looking for it. On the left picture, it's an example of a Degas frame for our collection with this specific Degas profile that he designed, as you can see on this little picture. And also on the right, it's a blue pointillist frame painted by Seurat himself. And just a little disclaimer here about that. I am not yet a specialist of artist frame. Maybe it will come with the years, but for now I'm still learning at the Musée d'Orsay. So my objective today is to introduce the topic of my PhD thesis with a little bit of context in the first part, and then in a second time, I'll explain to you my research method, a little bit inspired by the socio-environmental science field, to end by a presentation of the result of a discussion of the study of the 19th century Parisian frame makers. So the Musée d'Orsay has about 6,520 frames, mostly from the second part of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. for which I and 3 other colleagues are responsible. Our team dedicated to the collection of frames has been in existence for almost 3 years, so it's pretty recent, and we are helped by 2 freelance professionals, a frame maker and a gilding conservator. This collection can be divided in 2 categories: the 5,800 frames on paintings and the 720 empty frames. First of all, before going into more detail about our collection of empty frames, I would like to give you an idea of the scale of our activity in relation to frames on paintings. In the last 3 years, we have carried out full conservation treatments on 29 frames, and we have also worked on 29 reframing projects. You can see on the right picture one of the most interesting one that we did last year. We reframed a painting of Van Gogh, Les Chaumes à Cordeville, with a copy of its original frame, because the original one that you can see on the picture couldn't fit anymore because of the damages of the structure. And also, in the past 3 years, I did minor interventions on 207 frames, at least, because sometimes I don't even have the time to record all these minor interventions. Also, as a background work, we are starting to build a management process by creating a dedicated documentation that did not exist before, because these frames don't have any identification numbers or proper tracking files at the moment. And the documentation that we have is spread into paintings or pastels files. Now, let's take a look at our collection of empty frames. It's a collection of 720 items, mostly from the 19th century and the 20th centuries, as you can see on the little diagram on the left. And most of them are stored hanging on racks or grids, I don't know how do you call it, distributed in 3 different storerooms dedicated to the frames. All the empty frames have an identification number that begins with the acronym ICMO, that means Inventaire Cadre Musée d'Orsay, followed by a randomly assigned number printed on a small white label stuck to the back of the frame. These numbers are not proper accession number. We didn't create a permanent record in the French artwork database. It's more like an administration number. All the information is just recorded in a repertory, a very basic Excel spreadsheet in which they are described and photographed. This is Isabelle Kahn around the 90s, who created this basis of this file. Then between 2016 and 2018, I completed it. The new columns I created are the green ones. I added technical information, measurements of the rabbet, of the sides, photographs of the label, the name of the frame maker, if we could identify one, an assessment of the condition of each frame, and an estimate of all the conservation treatments. Then later, when I came back for good at the Musée d'Orsay in 2021, we continued this project and integrated some of this information into the database. This is not available online yet, but this is one of the objectives, and working on the collection of empty frames will allow us to reproduce a well-framed process for the frames on paintings. Alongside this work on the database, we also launched a collection survey with the help of a group of students, which allowed us to verify the data and remove the dust from 350 frames. This last survey was, of course, the occasion to train the students in the preventive conservation of the frame collection. I never miss an occasion. And as you can see in the central picture, for example, they learn how to write the registration number to replace the first white label that were just temporary. So from the start, these surveys and all the data collected since the 90s had two main objectives: to allow us to reuse some of the frames and to study the heritage value of this collection, because we didn't know anything. And it happened that out of more than 720 frames, only 35% were reusable after a few hours of treatment, and the other were considered to be in fair or poor condition. And to give you an idea, this frame on the right represents well what poor condition means here. The surface is very dirty. There are also bronze painting on the surface. There are many ornamental losses, and the wooden structure is slightly deformed. It's not a great result, a great statistic, but it's not surprising either, because most of the frames were replaced because of their condition and then stored here. It turns out, however, that despite the average condition of this group, we have been able to reuse at least 12 frames in the recent year. And so, what about the heritage value of these collections? Thanks to these works, we were also able to identify some historic frames. Thanks to the labels on the back, I identified 20 original frames. Here is an example. It's a frame made by a frame maker known as André Hip, as the label indicated it. And it was originally on a painting by Alexandre Cabanel, a great figure of the academic painters of the 19th century. You can see in the middle picture, this one, the painting is now framed with a newer gilded frame. And on the right picture, it's the artist himself in his studio, and hanging on the wall behind him, you can see the painting with the frame that we have in the storage. This frame is even more significant because it's part of a series of André Hip frame, because it seems that he framed a lot of paintings by Cabanel. And as I discovered during a survey of frame collection in other French museum, it is maybe a testimony of Cabanel tastes and of the frame craft technique of this time. But for now, we don't have the project to reunite the painting and the frame. So in the end, 20 original frames over 720 frames, it's not that much, but it's already interesting. And we still have a lot of unidentified ones. And by unidentified, I mean that they are not linked to a painting as far as we know. Among the 700 remaining, some of them caught my conservator eye attention, like this one, a fluted pine molding frame, and it appears that it was made by Cluzel, as you can see on the label, the remains of the label here, a framer known for his collaboration with Impressionist artists. Until recently, this label was unknown because no one took the time to study the back of the frame, and yet you had to know this framer to be able to read and understand this incomplete label. So I am really happy that we brought back to life this frame, but unfortunately we are not able to find the corresponding artwork for now because we have no record and no documentation in the museum. And another one of my favorites from the empty frame collection, this is this beautifully crafted water gilded frame decorated with delicate Renaissance foliage made from French paste. That's how I call your compo, but without the oil in the recipe. What I find very delicate here is that they are not trying to reproduce carved gilded wood, but they are using the smooth effect that molded ornament offers. Sadly, these frames had no labels, no information at all either. Only the ornamentation and some research I did in 19th century suppliers' catalogue suggests that it was probably made around the 1850s. I haven't managed to find the exact corresponding page for this presentation, the page of the catalogue, but you can at least observe the correspondence in style and proportions. So in just a few years, this collection's significance was slowly emerging. But I was acutely aware of the lack of documentation in the museum and in French bibliography on 19th century French frame makers. So I asked myself, what could I do to enrich our knowledge on 19th century frame makers in a broad sense? And this question leads us to my thesis. At the end of 2019, after having been confronted with many frame collection surveys, and not only at the Musée d'Orsay, but also as a freelance conservator, I decided to start a PhD, which was officially interrupted in 2021, but I'm still working on it from time to time, waiting for the time to officially manage both my career at the Musée d'Orsay and this research. So I've never had the chance and the opportunity to share this research before, so you will be my first audience. I will start by giving you an outline of my project to explain the subject of the thesis, and then I will go into more detail, showing you my methodology and the first results. Throughout my career, I've noticed that the lack of historiography on French frame makers from the 19th century, as well as the real mass production of frames in the same century, has led to a disinterest in these artistic objects. Unfortunately, we are used to studying them only from the point of view of the history of painting, and when they do not frame a painting, they lose a part of their identity, and the other part is rarely known or recorded or described somewhere, and they become mute objects. Whereas you have to preserve them, you have to know them, you have to sort them. It's artistic objects. So what can we do? That's in this context that the study of 19th century framing companies seem to be the right direction. In my thesis, there are two main focuses. First, the professional environment of frame makers, and the second is about the technical inventiveness in frame making in the 19th century in Paris. In order to gather meaningful information, I started by identifying four main sources: the annual list of Paris suppliers, the framemaker invoices in public archives, the 19th century industrial art exhibition catalogues, and the 19th century patent database. My first year was really dedicated to detailed study of the annual list of Parisian merchants, which we usually called it as the boutin. To show you what it looks like, here are two cover pages. One is from the beginning of the century, and the other one is from 1900. This annual publication is really a first-rate source for any research on 19th century Parisian commerce of any scale. It's known as a very reliable source for the scholars. Inside, you will find an alphabetical classification of all the professions and trades for which the registration was free. This page on the right is an abstract of a page dedicated to frame making specific category. Here, it begins here, and here you have the list in the last column, and it's from 1890. So in order to better understand how this profession was organized, I made a systematic study of all the sections relating to frame making crafts from the beginning to the end of the century. I studied also the evolution of the section names and the number of trades in each of them. It was a lot of data, and it's been really interesting to analyze it, see how it gives a more precise understanding of these crafts. Recently, I have also tried to deepen this research, and I have started to study the patent database as well. Through this second source, I tried to understand what kind of technical subject frame makers were interested in, or what kind of professionals were interested in frame making. After making a list of keywords, I extract all the patents relating to frame making from the database and classify them by subject and date of deposit. You have to know that the Botin and the patent database are available online, so you can access you also. So the graphs I'm about to show you are the first results of our analysis. First of all, it's interesting to see the evolution of the section name in the Botin, which are schematized here. I began by pointing here the Le Chapelier law, which ended the French corporation and guild system as a starting point for the mutation of the frame-making ecosystem. Alongside the traditional trades here, so gilder, mirrors, maker, joiners, carvers, which lasted throughout the century, we can see from 1923 onwards the gradual emergence of specialized branches of frame making, linked to specific skills, starting with the suppliers of carton-pierre Narmanche, which of course existed before, but here it became a separate branch underlining the perennial nature of this technique. Then from 1929 onwards, you'll see that a number of cabinet makers or joiners clearly indicate that they work on and quasi only on moldings and frames. This shows us that this was probably an important part of their activity. It was also the year in which frames appeared as a separate category, and frames became probably the main production of more workshops than ever. Finally, in 1844, the category framing of prints, painting, and pastel appears, and they all last until the end of the century. Now, if you take a look at this diagram showing the evolution of the number of suppliers in each category over the century, what can we say? First, there's a clear general increase over the century. There's a clear general increase of supplier here, this part, until the first French stock market crash in 1882. This is obviously due to the multiplication of arts fair, museum, the birth of liberal system, and of new social categories. And if we combine this observation with the previous observation I made about the evolution of the category names, we could say that from the end of the 19th century to the first stock market crash in 1882, the frame-making craft was reorganizing itself as it tried to adapt to a growing demand. Two phenomena seem to overlap, with the technical specialization of certain suppliers on the one hand and the diversification of services offered by the major company on the other hand. To complete this analysis, I isolated two categories: print, drawings, and painting framers, and framing molding, for which the curves are different from the other if we look the period after the market crash. We can see in this graph an increase of print, drawing, and painting framers, which coincides with the appearance of a specific framing molding section in 1881. It appeared at a time of peak activity in frame making and stabilized until the end of the century, while the number of frame making firms declined, as we saw in the previous graph. So the development of industrial molding and low-cost mass production clearly came after the financial crisis in a frame-making ecosystem seeking to rebuild itself at a lower cost. And it is also, of course, the consequences of the development of prints, engravings, drawings that needed to be framed for the bourgeoisie, the museums, the collectors, and so on. And you can observe the same tendencies when you take a closer look at the history of the Souty company, who tried to maintain their business throughout several generations during the 19th century. At first, in 1823, Sauté's company is quoted in the Bottin as wood gilder, and in the 80s, 50s, the company seems to have enjoyed a golden age, taking part in several industrial art exhibitions, as you can see in the invoice header here, as we call it in France, and the Paris Universal Exhibition in 1855. There, he won a bronze medal for gilded compo frames, of which we have an example in our collection of anti-frames. A water and oil gilded frame with its original gilding, decorated with very rich ornaments of acanthus leaves, exhibited in 1855 Paris Universal Exhibition as a frame for a view of the Antwerp harbor by Felix Diem. And yes, it's not carved wood, but as far as I know, the creation of that kind of object really requires the skills of a gifted craftsman that really have to master the casting techniques. So for me, in light of this historical and technical observation, this frame became one of the masterpieces of our 19th century empty frame collections. So finally, after this productive period in 1883, just after the economic crisis, the company Sauté is registered in the Bottin in no less than 9 categories. The company seems to expand its services as a struggle for survival, but 8 years later, the company is sold to a wine merchant and it disappears from the Bottin. The red pictures show you the record of Sauté business sales in 1891. So, as I told you earlier, I had a little bit of time this year to update my research, and I started to study the patent database. In a way, the initial results are in line with the study of the Bottin. You can see in gray here, in this graph, that you have many inventions about techniques on ornaments between 1830 and 1860, while the third part of the century here was more focused on framing molding machines. As an example, here is a patent in which the author, a frame maker, describes a mechanical system for ornament frieze with a bench system with a wheel that prints ornaments on the paste. And here are the drawings made by the author to illustrate his creation. And this drawing reminds me a lot of a frame from our collection around a huge pastel of Rosa Bonheur, when you can almost feel the paste of the arabesque melting into the gesso underneath. These arabesques are for me a reliable technical witness of this kind of molding, printing paste technique. And I feel like when you understand that frame maker really had to protect their inventions to be more competitive, but also more creative, it gives the most beautiful frames of the 19th century another degree of importance. So all these initial studies suggest that the reorganization of the world of frame-making took place in 3 stages. Firstly, after the Revolution, Le Chapelier law paved the way for a liberal system with the end of the corporation. But the move toward the liberal system seemed to be gradual. Around the 1830, the first mutation took place with workers and small artisans specializing, while the large companies expand their production. It was during this period that frame-making probably reached its peak in terms of decorative richness and quality in the 19th century. Then the system stabilized until 1892, when the scene was once reorganized. The industrial production of molding allowed framers to reduce their production costs and their new customers for their new customers. Traditional method of production declined, but did not disappear, of course. So as expected, there is a close link between the gradual transformation of these trades and the political and economic events of the 19th century. And just to challenge those results that are more representative of the big tendencies of the 19th century. This is another frame from our collection of empty frames. This is an original frame of a painting by Victor Binet. The painting is called Marin, Sailors. It's a scene of sailors bargaining near a harbor. So despite the fact that the richness of the ornamentation contrasts with the simplicity of the scene depicted, this is clearly an interesting case, and perhaps one day we would reunite them. It's an oil and water gilded frame with plaster ornaments designed in a mix of 18th century inspiration with a direct quote to the subject of the painting. If you look at the waves created in the reparure and all the organic shape in the leaves. It could also be a soft slide to the Art Nouveau. So regarding the history of the painting, this frame was probably an order from the States, which bought the painting as soon as it was finished. But my point is that this very interesting frame was made in a period that I called earlier the mass production period, but clearly a very talented team of craftsmen persists all along the century. And I will end with this rare portrait of a framer, Van den Berg, painted by a painter called Louis-Gustave Ricard and offered to the framer. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Elise. That is absolutely fascinating. I'm especially intrigued by your, use of patent record. That is so brilliant, and a great use of the archive. That's just brilliant. I can't wait to hear more about your project as it advances. Our next talk, as I mentioned, is pre-recorded by Liza Nathan from Tate Britain, who is currently on a courier trip in China. So we'll watch this talk now from her. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Liza Nathan, and if you're watching this pre-recording, it's likely because I've had some kind of technology fail in Shanghai where I'm currently working. So I'm apologising for not being here live, but thank you to the Art Gallery of Ontario for organising this conference. This talk is about a project I worked on about a couple of years ago, and I'll dive straight in. So, frames are subject to changes in fashion. They're conserved and restored to varying degrees, returned to different decorative schemes, altered, or altogether changed. And crucially, every change reflects the time in which it was carried out. This talk will consider 3 known frames that have housed the painting Head of a Man, possibly Ira Frederick Aldridge by John Simpson. It will consider the factors influencing its framing within the context of its custodianship, first under the patron and collector Robert Vernon, and later as displayed at Tate from the 1990s to the present day. As a brief caution, some of the language used on the historical images in this presentation is archaic and no longer in use. The portrait was painted by the British artist John Simpson around 1827. Simpson studied at the Royal Academy and was assistant to the artist Sir Thomas Lawrence. He gained success as a portrait painter and later in his career established his own painting practice. The portrait was first exhibited at the British Institution in 1827, and it is thought to be a portrait of the actor Ira Frederick Aldridge. Aldridge was an American-born actor and playwright who moved to the UK and was most notable for his Shakespearean roles. He was the first Black actor to play Othello in the UK at the London Theatre in 1826. The painting, closely linked to Simpson's larger subject matter painting entitled The Captor's Slave, which you can see here on the right, can be interpreted as a commentary in the ongoing dispute over race and slavery, which reached its pinnacle during William Wilberforce's abolitionist movement. The work was purchased around the time of its first exhibition in 1827 by the collector Robert Vernon, who lived a few doors down from the British Institution at Pall Mall. Vernon was a jobmaster, posting contractor, and dealer in horses, amassing his fortune by supplying horses to the British armies during the Napoleonic Wars. His art collection was one way of increasing his status in society, for a long lineage of titles and generational wealth were paramount. Vernon curated his collection carefully to emphasize his intellect and taste, selling works he no longer admired to make room for new acquisitions. When he bequeathed his collection to the nation, he even produced a list of works that he believed to be the most appropriate. The display, and as Pall Mall property, was similarly carefully thought through, surrounding them with plain furniture and even dulling down the brass hanging rods. Vernon's aspirations to elevate his social standing through art can be observed in his interactions with John Sheepshanks, another middle-class English tradesman, with a substantial collection of contemporary British art. Sheepshanks proposed a joint gift of both their collections to the nation, contingent upon the government providing an appropriate building to house them. Vernon declined Sheepshanks' offer, carefully timing his own bequest to ensure he would be the sole name to present a significant collection of British art works to the nation. He also insisted that the collection be displayed in rooms designated as the Vernon collection. Given how closely he controlled how his collection was presented and how it represented his aspirations, it seems likely he also considered how they were framed. Vernon often bought works directly from the artists. However, he also likely employed frame makers. When acquiring a work by artist John Calcott Horsley in 1839, Vernon refused the frame, stating, "That is not my pattern of frame," though Horsley goes on to suggest that he thought Vernon did this to avoid paying the full sum of money. Examining examples from Vernon's bequest reveals a consistent style. Many feature an inward sloping cushion adorned with small-scale foliage or Arabesque ornamentation. This innovation, a popular trend of the period, driven by the invention of composition ornament. This innovation resulted in frames becoming wider and deeper with more intricate decoration. Vernon's relatively short collection period between 1820 and 1847 likely contributed to the homogeneity in the styles of his frames. It's unknown at what point Vernon chose and fitted a circular frame to Simpson's portrait, though looking at the back of the frame, it likely had been altered to accommodate this painting. Therefore, it may initially have been made for another painting altogether. Perhaps this portrait replaced a painting Vernon considered less significant, and by framing it in an existing frame from his collection, Simpson's portrait was distinctly associated with the Vernon collection, as well as neatly fitting into a space that hung in his staircase. Alternatively, did Vernon intend for this portrait to stand out by placing it in a circular format? Fortunately, we may never know his intentions. However, we can tell that the style harmonizes with the surrounding collections and reflects the stylistic features of the time. Once bequeathed to the National Gallery, Vernon's collection was displayed elsewhere due to space constraints. Tate Britain was opened in 1897. This housed the original bequest from Henry Tate. As the National Gallery became overcrowded, it gradually transferred the Vernon collection to form a gallery of British art. Simpson's painting entered Tate's collection in 1919. It went into storage and unfortunately fell into disrepair. Now let's move forward to the 20th century. In 1993, there was an exhibition of Robert Vernon's gift. The condition of the painting and frame were considered during this period, although the painting was not included in this exhibition. What is telling about the preparation of this display is how the then frame conservation team went about conserving, restoring, and making new frames, which ultimately informed the choices around the design of the portrait's second known frame. The focus of frame conservation in the 1990s was to restore original frames where possible, prioritizing significant frames. Replica frames were considered if restoration wasn't feasible. These frames were researched and thoughtful in their design, but as is often the case, they were constrained by time and budget. The catalogue for this display in 1993 notes that John Anderson, the then head of frame conservation, had designed new picture frames to replace those that had been removed and lost in earlier years. And with his colleagues, he has carried through the most intensive programme of frame restoration that Tate has ever undertaken. Over a dozen frames are treated and over half a dozen made. The design of these frames was heavily influenced by a large quantity of pre-purchase mouldings, utilising netting and corner and centre motifs to break up expansive areas of gilding. While rooted in historical accuracy to some extent, this design primarily served as a practical solution to produce numerous frames within a tight frame and budget. Examples from this display reveal frames of uniform design, generally presenting a simplified version of a historic frame from this period. Simpson's portrait was later acquired for exhibition in 1995. Treatment for the Vernon frame was started but then discontinued, perhaps due to time and budget restraints, though this is unknown. As a temporary solution, a simplified version of the Vernon frame was created. Designed at Tate, it was constructed externally using softwood with an MDF board centre. This frame was categorised as a temporary frame, implying that it was not initially deemed the ideal fit for the painting, and there was an intention to restore the Vernon frame. In 2022, work commenced on the Tate Britain rehang, which involved redisplaying the permanent collection. The director of Tate Britain expressed that the rehang provided an opportunity to convey a more expansive story of British art in ways that resonate with us today. We want to show art that isn't made in a vacuum. It's made by real people living in the real world, by exploring the connections between artists and the times they live in. We can shed new light on Britain's greatest artworks and showcase a wider range of perspectives and ideas. Simpson's painting certainly aligns with this narrative. Notably, the painting is one of the few works at Tate Britain from its time period depicting a Black individual by a British artist. From a conservation perspective, the rehang provided an opportunity to undertake numerous treatments on artworks that had been in storage, as well as those that had been continuously displayed and were previously inaccessible. Many Tate colleagues have debated the appropriateness of the 1990 circular frame. Its intended purpose was temporary, and as mentioned earlier, its aesthetics and materials were not appropriate. The rehang enabled a re-evaluation of the portrait's framing and allowed the painting conservator to consider potential treatments. Most significantly to frame conservation, a catalogue entry of the painting was found for its first exhibition at the British Institution in 1827. This entry gave frame dimensions of 3 foot 4 inches by 2 foot 10 inches. These dimensions can either relate to an oval frame or a rectangular frame, likely with an oval slip. Additionally, during the examination of the painting, a gold line was discovered just below the painted spandrel, suggesting that a gilded frame originally bordered this edge. Considering how much the circular frame covered the painting, it is likely that the portrait was originally housed in a non-circular frame. This discovery further prompted a reassessment of the suitability of the then current circular frame. So you can see here how much it's covering the painting. Therefore, it was decided that the Vernon frame should be obtained from storage, fitted to the painting, and assessed whether it should be restored or if a new frame be made for the painting. The Vernon frame presented a strong case for restoration. It shares a significant connection with the painting, likely chosen by Vernon, having housed the portrait for over 100 years. Its design is contemporaneous to the painting, offering an improvement over the then existing frame, while fitting stylistically within the collection. However, restoring the frame would be no easy feat, evidenced by the fact that it had already gone through multiple restoration attempts. Most significantly, there was no escaping the fact that this frame had a circular aperture, which we now know was not the original format. Art historians have likened the composition of the painting a figure looking upwards to an expanse of sky, to a tradition of divine imagery, with the far-off gaze suggesting philosophical reflection or moral aspiration. In the opinion of the painting conservator, curators and me, the circular aperture of the frame visually pinned in and oppressed the image. The rehang offered the opportunity to address these issues by seeing more of the painting through an oval aperture. It would allow the audience to view the painting in a way that was more likely to align with the original intentions of the artist. It was therefore agreed that a new frame using traditional techniques should be made. With the support of my colleague Adrian Moore, the process began to make a replica frame. The first step was to look at other John Simpson portraits. An oval frame seemed improbable due to its required width to cover the canvas dimensions. Therefore, frames of an inner slip frame became the focus. And inner slip, I mean something like this inner bit here. The Duke of Wellington portrait at Apsley House provided a good example, not only because it is extremely likely to be the original frame to the painting, but it's also a rectangular frame for an oval portrait. The choice was restricted as I had to choose a frame that was easily accessible for a repeated use on which to base a design. This is because to make casts of ornamentation, I was required to apply casting material onto the surface of the frame, in addition to taking accurate measurements and unfitting the painting. This is a lot more easily accomplished with works that you already have permission to handle. With this in mind, I chose a frame around a painting by Penry Williams. It had ornamental design almost identical to the 19th century Vernon frame. It was an apt way to acknowledge the portrait's frame history. Once I had my model to base the new frame on, I made a profile drawing of it, which was then slightly altered, and this was given to our conservation technicians who made the pine frame. They saw some recycled mahogany, the slip frame. Mahogany would have been a typical wood used for a slip frame at this period, due to its durability, stability, and fine grain, which prevents the thin edges of the aperture from splitting. I then moved on to the beginning process of making composition ornament. We did not have any original reverse carved molds of ornament for this frame, so we've made our own. This is made in polyester resin, as it needs to be a durable mold that could have repeated use and withstand pressure from a book press. The outer frame is slip frame with gessoed. The frame was then cross-hatched. Sand was applied to the flat with animal glue. Composition ornament was pressed and applied to the frame. The frame was then oil and water gilded and toned with watercolour. And here is the final result. So what does this frame reveal about the context of its creation? It reflects the preferences of staff who found the 1990s circular frame unsuitable and believed in a more historically authentic framing approach. The choice was shaped by available tools, budget, and time. Whether intentionally or not, Vernon's influence was evident. The frame was modelled after one of his, partly as a nod to his role in making the painting accessible to the nation, and partly because Tate has his collection to refer to. The fact that a cast was taken from the ornament from another Vernon frame, ornament which has shrunk and degraded and improved and altered by the frame conservator, is itself a reinterpretation of the original. In this sense, today's 19th century replica will inevitably have a contemporary twist that future conservators might consider altering. In today's Tate, where displays change and artworks frequently go on loan, the frame offers crucial historical context to the painting's presentation, wherever it is displayed. Thank you very much, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Liza. That was really, really brilliant, and what a successful replica frame. You know, we've talked so much about the kind of the possibilities of what a replica frame can do, and that's very, very thoughtful. So we're now going to take a 10-minute pause. We'll return at 5 minutes after the hour, so that everyone can take a pause and stretch their legs and pour themselves some tea. and then we'll resume for a session that is moderated by Tracy Gill of Gill and Lagodich. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you.